Good evening, everybody, and welcome again to our Defra Future Farm Resilience webinars. This is our fifth webinar in the series, and this one's going to be on planning. And planning has certainly, in the feedback I've had so far, been a very popular choice of intervention. So my name is Beeton. I head up the project for Brown&Co. We are going to run for about the next 50-55 minutes. We are going to record this so that anybody can watch it afterwards in your own time. And we really want to encourage as many questions as we can over the next 50 minutes or so. I'll introduce you to the panelists in a moment, but one of the things that I think really makes these webinars interesting is receiving questions. And so to ask any questions, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. Please type in your questions to that, and we'll see them. I'll read them out and we'll respond to them. Anything we can't respond to, we'll follow up with afterwards on email. And so this evening, on the next slide, this is what we're going to do. We are joined by Lydia Pravin on my left, who's one of our planners, Matthew Rook, who's also one of our planners, and then we have Gil Watchhorn, who's in the Land Agency Department, and Henry Howarth, who is our Energy Manager. And we're going to be talking about planning, energy efficiencies, renewables, nutrient neutrality, some of the things that I'm sure will be of interest to many. So just moving through the programme, the next slide really sets out what this project's about. I'm sure many of you who've been on these webinars already will be familiar with this one. So this one is around the scale-up phase of the project, and this runs the next 2.5 years to March 25, and Defra trying to support farmers as we move through that transition. The biggest thing affecting them is loss of BPS, but looking at opportunities, and obviously planning around land and buildings and energy is something that will provide new income streams and opportunities for farmers. Next slide, please. So for those of you who don't know Brown&Co, so we are a diverse group of land agents, agricultural business consultants, environmentalists, and commercial and planners. We work across all of England. And I think one of the things that makes us very strong is the breadth of professionals we have. So we can pretty much provide solutions to most opportunities, challenges, areas of interest on farm. And we've been delivering this project for the last 2 years for Defra, and we will be probably one of the biggest providers in this scale-up phase. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we've managed to do over the last 2 years of delivering the project is really learn and understand where the needs are out there. So originally when the project was put in place, I think Defra was very much thinking it was going to be driven by policy change. As we leave the European Union, we know that the Common Agricultural Policy will drop and will come back to a national policy. And that's going to be driven by public money for public goods. So it's policy led support. But then what's happened since then? Well, we've had lots of external shocks. And I think particularly relevant for tonight, we've got high input costs, and obviously energy is one of those. So we'll be thinking about what we can do about that. We've got plenty of push and desire for diversification now to try and fill that BPS gap, and using land and buildings to do that is something that a lot of farmers are looking at. In addition to that, there's the usual stuff that the farming sector has to deal with around succession and transition, and then we've got a very changing climate. And I don't think we expected today's webinar to be quite as cold as it has been. We've got another climate little surprise on us at the moment with this cold snap. So the next slide really just sets out who we work with. We are working with all farmers. We're working across all of England in this project, and we've worked with tenants, we work with livestock farmers, we work with older farmers, and we do hope this time that we can build into those farmers who probably want a little bit more around technology adoption and support, collaboration, and to help support a little bit more of some of the innovation and productivity in businesses. I think the next slide is quite interesting because, again, this is what we learned, and again, relevant for tonight. Of the 750 farmers that we sampled last time, 81% believed that they had land or buildings with potential to add value. And from that, from an interest in environment, from interest in succession, from an interest in knowing that change is coming, we pulled together our 7 different support interventions, and one of which is around planning. That's the theme for tonight's webinar. But just to make sure everybody's clear on the range of interventions, the next 6 slides will run through those. So the first one is offering an overall business review. And I would say that farmers can choose any one of these to take up with us. So the first one is an overall business review. It's usually a good starting point. And this is one that we recommend people start with initially. The second one gets into more detail on budgeting and planning. So this is, rather than looking back at the last 3 years of accounts that are generally very out of date with how things have changed in the last 12 months, this will look at budgeting, cash flow management, requirements for overdraft facilities, thinking about profitability this year and next year. So it's looking forward and adapting and understanding how that figures with the changing market. And we're also looking at budgets for change as well. So taking on new diversification, putting in place some form of renewable energy, or putting in place some form of new income scheme that might be around, engagement with the public or something. We can look at that under the diversification partial budget within this option. The next really looks at technology and collaboration, and we expect there to be new rounds of grant schemes coming up now. This government is going to be very keen on technology as labour saving initiatives, or really just to drive up productivity. And this intervention can help support that. It can help understand what the effects might be, and it can also help position for some of the grants, and will actually help people get on that grant ladder. We'll also look at other forms of collaboration, pulling together farmers with neighbours, with groups, and thinking how particularly labour and machinery costs can be driven down. The third one is looking at land and property planning, which is tonight's webinar. So we'll skip over this one. Then the fourth one looks at natural capital. Really what this does, it looks at an overall environmental strategy for the farm. So it says, what's the most effective, appropriate use for any area of land? We're looking at assessing habitats, positioning for the emerging biodiversity net gain market when it comes in next year, when the Environment Bill becomes live. We're looking at woodland creation and carbon, and we're looking at trying to optimise the mix between the rather confusing sets of environmental schemes up there, as stewardship is still here. SFI is now growing with its new modules that are coming on board. And then we were going to have local nature recovery, but that looks as though that's going to become stewardship, an advanced stewardship scheme. So understanding how those mixes most effectively work on the farm to maximise income, maximise delivery is something we can look at. Our fifth one is looking at greenhouse gas footprinting, and this is to establish a baseline. We think as we go forward, most, if not all businesses, whether in agriculture or not in agriculture, are going to have a baseline in the next few years. And once the baseline is in place, we can start thinking about how that is driven down. We can also talk a little bit about sequestration here, and thinking about income for carbon, sequestration in soil or woodland, and how that might provide alternative income streams. Although we won't go into great depth on that in this intervention, it's mainly around establishing where businesses are right now. And then the last one is specifically for tenants. We know that a significant proportion of land in the UK has got some form of tenancy on it. Obviously, tenants can take up any of the previous interventions, but this one provides, again, through our land agency colleagues, some specialist support in succession planning on particularly around how diversifications might be approached and shared with landlords, thinking about rent reviews, and really thinking about how that relationship might be around investment can be enabled. Okay, so all of these have been the subject of previous webinars, and I'm hoping in the chat that we'll have some links that will be going in now that will enable people, if you haven't seen them, to have a look at the previous webinars and the details on these. Okay, so if we move on to tonight's more detailed webinar and the subject, we're going to start with nutrient neutrality, I believe, and can I hand over to Matthew? Thanks, Matthew.
Yeah. Thank you, Greg. Thank you very much. When Greg mentioned about me speaking tonight about nutrient neutrality, for those who don't know, is a significant sort of issue across the planning environment, insofar as not just the Future Farm Resilience Fund, but it affects planning insofar as housing development, any overnight accommodation, so holiday accommodation, things like that. But as a bit of an overview, in March this year, Natural England wrote to 74 local authorities about the need for mitigation of the adverse impacts of nutrient pollution within designated protected sites. And the sites are shown on the screen there in the blue colour. This is where elevated levels of nitrogen and phosphorus have been found, mainly within the river systems. And it's thought that a number of factors have contributed to this, these being sewage treatment works, existing septic tanks, farming practices, but primarily, and most relevant for us today, is development pressures, particularly new housing development. So new housing that's linked into main sewer systems, connecting into treatment plants, which are then connecting onto the river systems. And that's where the elevated levels of nitrogen and phosphorus are making their way into the river system. So this is it's a significant issue. If you've done any reading around it, it's preventing a lot of planning permissions from being issued. Additional housing is thought to increase the impacts on nutrients, and Natural England have put a hold on that at the moment until a mitigation strategy can be put in place. And I'll speak about that shortly. The protected sites are the whole catchment areas of rivers. As you can see, they're designated as SSSIs, so sites of special scientific interest or special areas of conservation. And relevant to us in Norfolk, the Norfolk Broads are also included within that protected areas. So across the country, this is principally affecting Norfolk, Hampshire, Dorset, Somerset and Cumbria, but there are other pockets, as you can see on the map there, that are also affected. It's important also to note that more areas could also be added as further investigations of river systems continue around the country. So next slide, please. So then we wanted to look at what the impact of the Natural England advice would be, and this is having serious impacts. No planning permissions have been issued for any development involving overnight accommodation within these protected sites, and that's since March of this year. These also include reserved matters applications and some discharge of conditions applications. So it's putting a real hold on things. And there's been an indication of the size of the issue. It's estimated that at least 100,000 homes are being held up. This also has a hold upon the delivery of affordable housing, community projects and funding for infrastructure. A further consequence is that in affected areas, some councils are now unable to demonstrate a 5-year supply. This might mean an opportunity for some landowners that are outside of the catchment zones, but it's effectively resulting in a kind of unplanned development outside the catchment areas, and some of these cases are actually being allowed on appeal now. Next slide, please. So the solution, government announced in November of this year 2 measures that they sought would achieve nutrient neutrality. So that's the term that in trying to sort of mitigate against the impacts, the harms are being outweighed by the benefits, and the benefits that the government are looking to introduce as a new legal duty on water companies in England to upgrade wastewater treatment works by 2030 in the nutrient neutrality areas. And I've highlighted or underlined there the requirement is to the highest achievable levels, which is open to interpretation, what that could mean. The second measure was a new mitigation scheme that Natural England is investing in new and expanded wetlands and woodlands. Developers then be able to purchase nutrient credits from Natural England to offset the impacts of development. Our concern with that is that these issues do not give any short or medium-term solutions. You see, the water companies have got until 2030, and Natural England, there's no timescale on when they can start introducing their wetlands and woodlands. So local councils need to step up and set up their own mitigation strategies. And in Norfolk, the details are expected to be published by spring next year. Next slide, please. So the challenges are, it's likely that larger housing developments will be expected to include on-site nutrient mitigation in the form of woodlands or even reed beds and ponds within their sites. And that's inevitably going to reduce the number of houses that a site would be able to accommodate normally. On smaller sites, where there is no ability to provide on-site mitigation, it's very likely that the councils will need to run a nutrient credit scheme so that a developer will pay the council for credits per dwelling to offset the nutrient impact of their development. This is already happening on the south coast. I mentioned about Hampshire and Somerset. This is a situation that they've been involved with in the 2 years previous. So they've been involved with this before, and they've set up their own nutrient impact mitigation schemes, albeit on their own council land. So to allow the credit scheme to operate, the council will need to either use its own land in suitable locations or enter into agreements with landowners to use their land for the mitigation scheme. We see that these mitigation schemes will be a sort of long-term agreement and a source of income for maybe a parcel of land with little or no productive potential, but could be very important in relation to nutrient neutrality mitigation. And then just finally on the slide there, we can see how we can help. We have professional planners. Greg's mentioned about the teams and our locations across the country. So we could act as planning agents for your planning application or your submission for barn conversions or reuse of agricultural buildings, and we could work that through on your behalf. Alternatively, if you own land and you'd like this to be considered as part of the council's mitigation strategy, our professional land agents can make these inquiries on your behalf to the local authorities to assess whether the land is in the right location, and then we could liaise with the relevant council just to follow that through on your behalf. So we feel Brown&Co are well placed in relation to dealing with both the planning aspects, but also some of the mitigation strategies as well.
Thank you, Matthew. I mean, just as a follow on to that, within farmers looking here who might have land that's being held up, who might think that they might have land that could provide some of the offset.
Yes.
How might this sort of the day and a bit of advice in this project, how might this help farmers to move either of those forward?
Well, it would be a recognition of the location of those, and if it's within one of the catchments and next to one of the waterways affected, then there's certainly an opportunity that we would draw out from our comments to say that this could be something that, obviously not as a building, but maybe as land that's got that potential. So that would be that would come through as part of our recommendations and advice.
Yeah. Okay. And your areas that you're looking at there, I know you're based in Norfolk, but some of the other areas, obviously, we can offer advice in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the issues are the same, whether it's in Norfolk or anywhere else. As I said, the areas are well defined as far as the protected sites. So that information would be available, and we would then include that within our recommendations on to the landowners as to how to best take these proposals forward.
Yeah. And what's your feeling on scope? You said there's potential for more regulation around SSSIs and protected sites coming in? Is there likely to be a second tranche, do you think, of areas?
It's it's one of those we'd never say never. I think it'd be one of those where certainly if it's seen that the affected areas have this mitigation and improvement, then it's very likely I can see Natural England looking very carefully at their existing water systems and their ongoing sort of regulation around water quality. So I could see it be one of these things, and certainly other colleagues think the same thing, that it could well be rolled out in much broader areas than currently we see.
Okay, thank you. We will, thanks. You're going to stay around and chip in any other questions, or see what we get as other questions as we move through.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Matthew. If we now move on to Lydia, Lydia's going to talk about more general planning, I think. Over to you, Lydia.
Thank you, Greg. So just looking at planning opportunities for your buildings and your land, sort of looking at the planning considerations more generally, and then sort of touching on the planning process and the timescales involved. Next slide, please. There's many opportunities for your land and buildings across the country. And like Greg was saying, we're well placed here at Brown&Co to offer that multidisciplinary approach. So you've got your permitted development opportunity. So the image there on the right is of some barns where a Class Q application was made to change the agricultural buildings. In this case, it was for 4 sort of terrace properties and 1 detached, including some building operations. And then you've got your Class R, which is change of use of agricultural buildings to a flexible commercial use only. But there is quite a raft of permitted development legislation. And what that means is before you sort of enter the realms of potentially needing an express planning application, there is this opportunity to consider what the legislation says, and subject to sort of looking at that, then submitting a prior approval scheme. Then you've got your formal planning application, like I said, where you do require the express planning permission. Maybe you can't comply with all of that legislation, which can be quite complex in its own right. We've had a range of schemes and successes with Class Q, then going in for an outline for new dwellings, a range of farm diversification schemes, and the building also shown there was actually a change of use to a commercial operation. But you've also still got your parcel for land on the edge of villages and towns, and also within the settlements, and then you can potentially promote your sites, so your land or your buildings, for redevelopment within the more formal local plans, the council's timetable for preparing where development may go in the future alongside their existing ones. Next slide, please. So yes, sort of as I've touched on there with permitted development, there is a raft of other sort of proposals potential, but some of the key ones are the Class Q and the Class R considerations. So the first starting point is making sure you comply with that permitted development legislation. And then if you do comply with that, particularly with Class Q and R, there's key issues then you will need to address through that prior approval application. This list is not exhaustive, but it can include transport and highways, noise, contamination, flooding, even odour now comes into it. So to some degree, some people see it as just as complex as a formal planning application, but it does exclude some aspects. And that might require quite detailed reports with specialist consultants prior to sort of making that application. We've also got chartered architects here as well within our planning team. So yeah, the formal planning application process side, that's sort of considered in line with the local plan, which sets out where development should be located. And as it says there, that will consider things even more depth than your prior approval application. So it will consider things like the principle of development, like is this the right location for this development? Things like the impact on the character of the area in the open countryside, for example, residential amenity. So it will go into even more detail than the prior approval Class Q or Class R or sort of type applications, really. Next slide, please. So yeah, just touching on the overall planning process and timescales. At the outset, definitely it's about getting the strategy right in light of the legislation. And if you do need surveys, which increasingly we're seeing applications need more and more surveys to tick the council's boxes, whether that be through the prior approval route or the formal planning application route. And there's just some brief information on timescales for Class Q and the Class R. That's a 56-day process. And most formal planning applications, they've got the 8-week timescale, and with the major sort of development schemes being 13 weeks and 16 weeks if you've got to provide an environmental impact assessment, which is for schemes where there's going to be a significant impact on the environment. So yes, to bear in mind those timescales and that sort of package that is needed to support your application once it goes in, and then obviously during that process is where we manage and monitor that and aim at the end to get that successful outcome from the council for you. So lots of opportunities.
Yeah, thanks, Lydia. One question that's just come in really around Class Q is what's the biggest challenge usually encountered with Class Qs? Do they go on for a long time, or can they be sort of sorted out and approved fairly quickly? What's the challenges that you see?
Yes, so some of the challenges are you can only do work within the envelope of the building, and the legislation allows you to add windows, doors, roofs, walls. So that seems quite extensive, but there is quite a clear caveat that says it has to be reasonably necessary for the building to function as a dwelling. So really at the outset, you've got to look at the building and really carefully consider, is this work actually a conversion project, or is it actually going outside that scope of a conversion? Because if it's outside the scope of Class Q, then the planners will say this is actually a new dwelling and it doesn't comply with the scope of that Class Q aspects. And in terms of timescales, with this kind of application, the council have those 56 days. If it's permitted development and they don't look at the prior approval application within that timescale, then it would be deemed consent. And equally, we're seeing with planning applications themselves, councils are very stretched at the moment. So there can be quite a lot of work involved once you've even got the application in to get that positive decision reached, really.
Okay. I think it'd be fair to say from the 750 farmers we worked with in the last phases project, we had a lot of interest in buildings, and the number of farmers I went to see, and it was always a topic of conversation. Oh, I think I can do something with that building. What might I be able to do with it? And I think this new round, this next 2.5 years, this main phase, now we've brought in this focused intervention, gives a great opportunity to call out Lydia or someone similar and actually go through it and work out whether this is a realistic proposition or not. And I think that really de-risks it for farmers. It de-risks any future spend. And I think that day of a professional opinion that can be delivered, I think is a game changer for most.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely great for farmers with the land and buildings to review that stage before you potentially consider further application work, whatever that might involve.
Yeah. And what we're likely to have in the report is a traffic light system of, after a day of a professional opinion, it's a red, which is this is not really going to go anywhere, or orange or amber, which is, yep, there's potential, green, we think there's real potential here. So it helps to inform of the next steps. Question, another one from the floor, is Class Q going to be discontinued at any point in the near future? Where did you get your crystal ball out?
It's not completely certain, as you might expect me to say. It is very much driven by national governments to repurpose and reuse buildings. So obviously at the moment we've got the Conservatives in, who knows where we're heading in terms of the election sort of side. They may well continue, but yeah, there is some unrest to some degree within councils about these types of schemes because they see them as being imposed by national government onto them. So yeah, I think, like you said, crystal ball gazing potentially, but at the moment I think it may well continue for a bit longer.
But we know we've probably got 2 years to the next election, do you think?
I would say so, yes.
For sure.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Oh, there's questions coming in. I'll give you another one, Lydia. Class R. Tell us about Class R. What does that actually entail?
So basically that's just a change of use application. So it doesn't allow you to do any operational development. And by that we mean any windows, doors, those kind of elements. It has got quite tight restrictions that it only allows you to do 500 square meters of floor space. And you can only change to Class B, storage and distribution, Class C, 1 hotels, and Class E, which is the commercial business or service provision. So you can only change from agricultural buildings to those kinds of uses. So if you do need operational development, sometimes we make the Class R application with a view to potentially doing a planning application for the operational development, depending on the nature of the building and the context of the site, really.
Sounds quite complex to me.
It can get quite complex, yes.
And let's sneak in one last quick question before we move on to Gilbert. Another one from the audience. Once you submit a Class Q application, if it were to be approved, do you then lose the right to submit any additional applications for additional structures under the Class Q in the future?
So the Class Q allows you to do within a certain amount of floor space a number of properties, but you do then, that does then mean that you can't do your agricultural development under the permitted development regulations for 10 years and vice versa. So you have got to think about your strategy as to what your farm needs are. And yeah, we can certainly advise further on those sort of steps, really.
Okay, so think about it up front as part of an overall strategy for a number of years.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Super. Great. Okay, well, we're just going to move on. We'll come back to any other questions at the end, but thanks. There's been quite a few coming in on this one, so great. Keep them coming in. Thank you, Lydia. Very good. Very interesting. And this is why we need experts like you. Let's now move on to Gilbert. Gilbert, I think, is going to talk about land and land market, and then a little bit about development land.
Indeed, Greg, thank you very much, and good evening to you all. I'm here this evening to sort of quickly gallop through the farmland market and development land supply markets. So without further ado, sort of kicking off with the farmland market, we've seen more supply than expected this year across the spectrum, while the costs of funds have recently and significantly increased for those that need to borrow to finance purchases. Values have remained strong, and that's been sort of underpinned by rollover buyers and those looking for tangible assets with a tax shelter in the face of wider market uncertainties. Differently, where there's an absence of rollover buyers and the neighbours are not curious or interested, values have been squeezed. Larger blocks have attracted more attention as buyers can either travel viably to farm the land or investors come out to play. Smaller blocks around 50 acres or less are sticky without neighbour interest in the market, and we've seen values range between £7,000 to £15,000 an acre, so very varied. Location is considered absolutely key, and also commodity prices, they maintain confidence, but land prices not always seem to follow the commodity trends as closely in the UK as it does in the USA, for example. We've been involved on and off with on and off market sales and purchases, and we have sort of experts across all of our offices that can help you in this regard. Just leading on, just in respect of the amenity market, that seems to have gone from strength to strength with small parcels up to say 10 acres or thereabouts, achieving significant premiums over and above their inherent agricultural value. In particular, where we've sold amenity parcels via auction, we've seen some remarkable results. That appears to be driven on the back of COVID, with people looking to own their small pieces of land, so they have their own space simply for their quiet enjoyment. In general, I think we can conclude to say that there is confidence in the farmland market, and we'll sort of expect there to remain so as we approach and enter into 2023. So just next slide, please. Leading on to the development market. This is getting quite sticky, and Matthew touched on this just a bit earlier in the presentation. And we've noticed sites which were at the bottom of the pile a year or so ago becoming desirable again. Generally, developers are short on sites, sites with consents that can actually be delivered. For example, the introduction of nutrient neutrality in Norfolk means no development, which involves overnight stays, overnight accommodations, can be consented with until a solution is agreed. That's reduced the supply significantly, with developers targeting sites outside of nutrient neutrality zones. As such, developers are going to be beginning to become less choosy in what we could construe to be a narrowing market. Some are nervous, though, through the cost of money and the implications thereof, particularly the affordability of buyers for built houses is reduced by the increasing cost of mortgage products. The interest rate has dampened market enthusiasm, and commentators such as Nationwide have reported a 2.3% decrease in the values since November. However, that's sort of countered slightly by the supply of the standard construction materials appears to have freed off, and contractor availability has increased. That should help calm the construction costs and cool some of the volatility that we may be experiencing and seeing across our areas of operation. We've seen developers elect to reduce activity for now with a view to looking again in the new year. And then just leading on, we can't really mention land supply without discussing the 5-year land supply, again, which Matthew touched on earlier. The 5-year land supply requires local authorities to be able to demonstrate sufficient land supply to deliver the homes required in their district over the next 5 years. A failure to demonstrate that means that the national planning policy framework supersedes the local plan, and then there's the fallback on the presumption in favour of sustainable development. In practice, a shortage of the 5-year land housing supply allows developers to make predatory applications, providing they're approved sustainable. Housing targets have been and are, as we speak, being subject to political posturing. Many members of the Conservative parties do not want to see housing targets and want to give more power to local communities to choose where development happens. That in turn is going to likely result in a reduction in delivery, as everybody recognises the need for new homes, just not here or not in my backyard. It's likely that local authorities with an up-to-date development plan will not have an obligation to maintain a 5-year housing supply in the future, and there are transitional arrangements proposed for those with the plans at an advanced stage of preparation, but of which to be adopted. There's more detail on those reforms are promised, and a consultation on the changes to the National Planning Policy Framework is likely before Christmas. We're expecting that before the sort of 20th of December, when Parliament will rise. And indeed, a letter from Michael Gove last week indicated that the government's aim is to get the new planning policy framework in place by April 2023. So it's a case of watch this space. As ever, good sites will still be desirable, and it feels as though we're moving backwards towards traditional long-term strategic development, with promotion in local plans, significant community engagement, and fewer applications based on a 5-year land supply shortage. It's hard to see how this will not result in fewer houses being built, particularly those affordable homes which are in great need. And it will probably stimulate less growth, neither of which is conducive to avoiding or exciting a recession. It may seem it's a bit sort of bleak reading for developers, and this may impact on value, but it's a guess a case of time will tell. Who knows what's going to happen to development land if we have a change in government. We've got experts in all areas of the business, whether that be the planning team or us as land agency, to help you with your land. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. And thank you. And if there's any questions, I'll be pleased to answer them.
Okay, thanks, Gilbert. Right, we've got a few coming in. One I was just going to ask you, and I think, you know, one of the challenges I think I see from farmers is that just not really sure whether a piece of land has potential or not. And so that's sort of, you know, what are the sorts of questions or that you would ask or look at if you were to go out and just look at the piece of land and say, you know, is this a runner? Is it worth doing anything else with it? Where do I go next?
Thanks, Greg. I think the first port of call, and with the sort of assistance of sort of Lydia's team and Matthew's team, is that we'd sort of have a look at how masses sit on the ground before sort of going back and looking at local planning policy, seeing where the settlement sits within the settlement hierarchy, and giving an overall appraisal for a start. We could also sort of got local developer contacts who we can sort of pitch the land around, and come up with the sort of the best sort of proposal that sort of meets not only the client's objectives, but it's also going to meet to the favour of the planners.
Okay. And sort of linked to that, another question here, and again, it's that sort of question of maybe a farmer's got a piece of land with some potential, he thinks, or she thinks. Do you sell it? You got people interested in buying it, sell it, or do you hold on and develop it yourself and move with it yourself? That's often a choice. Any views on that?
Well, I think it's sort of, you've got to consider each case on a case-by-case basis, and consider whether we sort of have the time and the capital sort of reserves to take that parcel of land from some sort of conception all the way through to development. We've got to be sort of semi-conscious that the cost of finance is increasing, and it might be sort of, that might be the case for a little while yet. I mean, if we did decide to sell it, we could protect the client's position through the introduction of a overage or what we often call sort of an uplift clause. So we still benefit from some of that receipt if it's developed in the future, but it really is a case of judging each case on its own merits and the client's objectives.
Yeah, so it's individual advice, and that's something that we can provide certainly a day of through this project to get out and have that discussion and at least share some of the options anyway.
Certainly, yeah.
Yeah. And one last, I've got a load of Class Q ones that we'll come back to with Lydia and whoever else in a minute, but I just want to just sort of link to this. How much, I don't know whether who this might, I want to answer this one, how much strength does a neighbourhood plan have in stopping a planning application? Any views on that from anybody, Matthew or Gilbert or Lydia?
I think Matthew or Lydia might be best placed to answer it, but as I understand it, if a neighbourhood plan has been adopted, it carries a significant amount of weight, more so than the sort of local plan. Is that right, Lydia?
No, it's considered to be part of the development plan, so it's got equal status as other sort of local plan documents. It's very much dependent on obviously what the relevant aspect of it is saying. If it's identifying a particular site that it favours for development, and not many neighbourhood plans do that, but if the particular neighbourhood plan identified one site and you're pitching on another site, then that's that could be a difficulty. But yeah, they do carry significant weight because they've been through local consultation, they've had local referendum. And there seem to be policies in there that we need to be having regard to when we're doing planning applications. So yeah, they can raise another issue for us to have regard to, put it that way.
Yeah, just Greg, also on that is that at the moment with the levelling up and regeneration bill, and they're proposing to say that neighbourhood plans would then, you'd have to show 5 years worth in terms of regard to them, whereas at the moment it's only 3 years in terms of the housing land supply. So potentially they're saying that that localism element could get stronger. Obviously there's quite a bit of a way to go in terms of the regeneration bill, but yeah, it's something that Michael Gove's clearly looked at. So yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Gilbert. I'm just going to try and nip in another quick question before we get Henry going. Probably for Lydia, but anyone, can Class Q be only used once per holding? How do you get around this for multiple buildings?
So yeah, I mean, obviously, like I said, sort of in the presentation, the starting point is looking at the buildings that you've got, looking at the planning strategy, because there's no real definition of the agricultural unit. But yeah, you've got to look quite closely at how you maximise those and consider them really.
Okay. Okay. And the last one I'll nip in is a building a dwelling under an agricultural tie. Sorry, is building a dwelling under an agricultural tie still possible? Do you have to develop an unused old barn in preference to a new building under an ag tie?
So the starting point is what the local plan says. So whatever the local plan for your area says would be the starting point to look at. They often do include within the policy to look at, have you got any existing buildings on site that you can use? So that often will be within the policy remit consideration, but it does depend on the specific policy. And yeah, we've had a number of schemes where we've got permission for new agricultural dwellings. We've set out reasons as to why some of maybe the existing buildings aren't suitable.
So possible, okay, yeah, good. Okay, well, we've got a couple more, we'll come back to those at the end. Henry, anticipation of what you're going to tell us about energy.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, so I'm just going to talk through sort of quite quickly just an overview of some of the energy viability work that we're currently doing and how that can sort of fit in with the FFR scheme, and as well as what the follow-up is from that really. So at the moment, renewables are having a sort of a huge spike in popularity again, especially solar and wind have got a new lease of life post-subsidy schemes like the feed-in tariff. So on site, I've just highlighted the 3 main areas of work that we've got the most interest in at the moment. First being the initial viability report. So this would include such a site meeting, discussion of technology, initial grid inquiry, basic planning appraisal, excuse me, indicative financial appraisal, and they'll basically tell you, is it worth me progressing with a renewable energy project? And this can all be completed under the FFR funding. So on from that, you'd then look at doing a full project viability study. So this is the sort of more in-depth, and this is what you want to do if you want to look at committing to moving forward with a project. So this would include a full grid application, a more detailed planning assessment that will be specific to your site, specific to the technology that you might have identified in the initial viability study. We'd also tender for the technology and use the quotations from that tendering process to put together an independent financial appraisal for it. And then the sort of the final one, which is sort of getting, I mean, over the last sort of week especially, a lot more interesting in is wind turbine scoping. Again, this is a follow-up from the initial viability. If we identify wind as being sort of a suitable technology for your site, you'd need to do a lot more information pre-planning, a lot more assessment than you would for other technologies. You've got to consider things such as radar, wind speed, airport safeguarding, civils quotations, and again, you need that full grid application. So yeah, wind is a much bigger consideration, and I'll touch a little bit more on sort of what's been discussed in terms of planning and what may or may not be coming up over the next sort of 6 months with that. Go next slide, please. So I'm just going to run over for the next few slides just what the main areas that these reports look at. So, I mean, firstly, we'll look at, you know, the reasons why the viability of these projects have increased. I think some of them will be fairly obvious. But the first one really is the technology is becoming cheaper, more efficiently. And the second, more obvious one is obviously the rise in energy costs. So at the moment, current energy prices are very difficult to accurately predict. As you can see from the graph on screen, we're somewhere around at the moment the highest prices that we're likely to see. However, that is obviously subject to change because last winter we sort of thought the exact same thing. The UK at the moment has lots of cheap offshore wind generation and more due to come online over the next few years. This should help to gradually reduce prices. This should lead to, in the long term, the electricity price to decouple from the gas prices. We're not relying on gas for electric in the UK, and this is why we've seen sort of quite big profits coming from these energy companies, despite energy prices being so high, because they're able to capitalize on all this cheap offshore renewables that they've got. So if you are looking at a project, be warned that the technology installers are trying to sell you something. So they're likely to base their projects on the current high prices to make the financials long-term look a lot better, and the payback of their technology seem better than it might actually be. So always bear that in mind. Current high prices are likely to last for 2 or 3 more years, and your renewable project is likely to last 20 to 25 years. So you need to think about it long term. There's always more value as well in offsetting your electricity rather than selling back to the grid on these power purchase agreements. Consider if you were paying 60 pence a kilowatt hour for the electricity that you're importing and using on site at the moment, you're likely to receive less than 30 pence a kilowatt hour for any extra you're generating and putting back in the grid at the same time. So maximize your offsetting where possible, and that's going to increase the viability of any project you're looking at. And that all comes down to sizing your project correctly to what you need on site. Just as an example, for a project we've looked at recently, we've seen payback of under 4 years, where they were able to use the majority of the power from their new renewable project on site. And when you consider you've got 20-25 year lifetime, then that's a very, very worthwhile project investment. There's also consider as well, you can adapt your site to work better for renewables. So this again is something we've done on a recent project for vegetable stores, where we've changed the timing of the refrigeration equipment, allowing it to basically kick in when the solar's operating better. Actually resulted in the site using more electricity, but because they were generating their own electricity, overall it saved their costs. So once you've got your project in, it's all about tweaking and matching it up to what you actually need. And next slide, please. So another major project consideration is grid connection. Unless you're completely disconnected from the grid, any new project will require a grid connection application. This is to ensure that your project doesn't have an impact on National Grid's infrastructure in the area. You need to make sure there's proper protection in place, otherwise you could be responsible for tripping the grid off in the entire area, which will come with heavy fines. So you must engage with the grid, whether you intend to export or not. This isn't a slow process. It can take 2 to 3 months minimum, or longer if higher levels of National Grid need to do sort of extended mapping to work out how that's going to work on their system. The image that I've put on this slide is from a Northern Power Grid capacity map. The red dots show low demand substations. Obviously, as can be expected, that is not a good sign. So where they are red is meaning that in that area, the capacity is potentially maxed out. Now, this map isn't always up to date, and there is always work going on, but it's just an indication of how constrained some areas of our grid is at the moment. The grid was not designed for having lots of small renewables generating and pushing power back up these very small 11 kV lines that are attached to your houses. It was designed for big generators pushing it down the huge sort of metal 32 kV, 132 kV lines, and then it's spreading down to the smaller sort of capillaries to your home. So now we're pushing it back up the wrong way, which has resulted in a lot more sort of areas where we can't put more generation in. However, it's always worth checking. Even a project, a project can work even with no export. However, export is always going to help. And there are things like time connections available where certain times of the year or certain times of the day you're allowed to export, where other times you're not. Early engagement, careful discussion with the grid is key in correctly sizing your project to maximize your connection and your business needs. Next slide, please. So planning. So for all kinds of renewables, some kind of planning is going to be a requirement, whether that's permitted development or full planning permission. Now, if you are going to go for permitted development, which can often be suited towards things like rooftop solar and often in the past as well, biomass boilers, you need to make sure you have this checked by an expert. We've had several cases where we've come on to a project to advise on something and realized they hadn't correctly assessed permitted development rights, and we've had to do a full retrospective planning application for them. So please consult an expert. Obviously, as we've said tonight, we've got a lot of planning experience within Brown&Co, so please speak to someone first just to make sure that you are getting it right. You take the risk that you pay for a full planning application, or you're told to take the project that you paid for down after a few years. As I said, solar can come under permitted development, but it would need prior notification, and that also comes with that 56-day deadline for the council to respond that was mentioned in the earlier planning talk. AD and wind are likely to need full planning. This can take up to a year and needs a lot of upfront assessment to ensure that the site is correct. There's going to be likely specialist reports with significant cost and significant lead times. So again, seek advice early. Don't rely solely on the technology supplier or installer. They're not planners. They are trying to sell you something. So make sure you get independent early advice on those sorts of things. And then as well, the thing that's sort of been updating and I sort of alluded to earlier is planning for wind. Over the last sort of week, it's been suggested that the planning policy framework will have an amendment in it to ease restrictions on wind turbine planning in April 2023, making projects much more viable than they have been over the last few years. So this could have a huge impact on how many more wind turbines we'll see onshore in the coming sort of years. A recent due diligence for one that went through on sort of the harder planning terms that we've seen suggested a 6-year payback with a project lifetime of 20 years, and this was with no on-site use at all, only export. So wind projects are very much still viable, and this could have a huge impact on the industry. So yeah, I hope that's been useful and giving you a sort of quick overview. So if there's any questions, do let me know.
Thanks, Henry. A lot of very solid information in there. And just a couple in. We're probably going to run over by a couple of minutes. Hopefully that's okay for everybody. I just want to get these last couple of questions in for Henry. There is one that's come in, and you may or may not have the answer to this, but I'll put it to you. It's about a reasonable fee for a DNO, IDNO to check if the grid connection is suitable for the project in mind. So is there a standard sort of fee that would be reasonable for that?
In terms of, some of the network operators will charge a set fee for initial discussions, which is usually about £300. Others will do it for free. So it really depends on the area that you're doing it. It can also be helpful if you have a contact there that might just give you a sort of a nudge to say, yes, put an application in here, or don't even bother going down the road. It's beneficial to the grid as well, not to waste their time having applications put in when there's really no point putting them in. If you do look at the maps online, which that image was taken from, don't rely on that as the holy gospel, because they're not updated that often. They do allocate smaller amounts for new businesses trying to connect smaller amount of renewables. Often, they're just trying to make sure that the big solar rental companies aren't just jumping on them straight away. So they do allocate little bits out. So yeah, always, get a second opinion, make sure you've engaged with the grid properly, because there could be something there. Right.
And I'll just ask you one more question, which is around battery storage, something that we hear quite a lot of questions on these days. Is there any value in using battery storage to maximise my onset use?
So in theory, yes. However, batteries, as you know from your mobile phones, their lifetime isn't great. Over time, they will slowly sort of being able to hold less and less charge. And we found that their lifetime has been about 7 years at the moment for sort of energy projects. And we've also found that due to the high upfront cost of them, the payback time is also about 7 years. So unless it's in some very, very sort of specific circumstances, potentially where you've got no grid connection at all, and you're reliant on that, batteries don't tend to work at the moment, not until that sort of technology improves and that cost comes down.
Great. Henry, thank you very much. I'm just going to move on to the last slide now, which is just putting it together and basically saying you've heard from our four experienced and capable presenters tonight. And so the question is, how do we pull this together in the report? What do you get? And I think, for any one of these areas, this project will provide, a report based on a day or so of input. And I think the real value that I see in this is it kind of de-risks, it gives some professional opinion, it de-risks any next move. And we know anything to do with planning is expensive. So here's a golden opportunity to get a bit more advice, to give a bit more confidence as to whether to do something or not to do something. And I think this is a really strong intervention within this project. So the last slide now is how to sign up. Many of you may have seen this before. So please to register interest in anything you've heard tonight or in any of the previous webinars across the other interventions. Do give us a call, send us a message, ring us up, send us an email, get on the website, register interest. We just need your SBI number, and then someone will talk to you about which choices your preferred choices are, and then the process will start around engagement with the professional who's going to come and see you and give you some support. The project runs for the next 2.5 years. We are suggesting people sign up sooner rather than later. At the moment, we're getting a lot of sign-ups, and the planning one is a very popular intervention, and we'd hate to run out of options in a year's time. So do sign up now, and then we can plan at some point in the future when we're going to work with you. So that's it for tonight. That's our last webinar for this year. So a big thank you to Matthew, Lydia, Gilbert and Henry. Please do ping us any other questions you may have. We'll be running some webinars again in next year. We're going to run one per month, starting in January, but it's the last one for this year. So thanks for listening. Have a good Christmas and a Happy New Year, and we look forward to working together in the future. Thank you all very much.